Hall & Wilcox acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands on which this podcast is recorded. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people joining us today.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode in the HW Funds podcast series about anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing. HW Funds is the investment funds team of the national firm Hall & Wilcox, and my name's Langton Clark, a partner in HW Funds. I'm delighted to be your host for this series. To date, we've covered the ABC of KYC, or Know Your Client, under the AML CTF regime, outsourcing the obligation of carrying out that process, as well as other obligations, and some significant reforms heralded to come in within the next 18 months. In today's episode, we'll look at dealing with risks and some common failures of AML CTF programs. And I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague, Andrew Ong, who's an expert in this area for today's episode. How are you, Andrew?
Good, Lincoln. Appreciate the invite to come on, and glad to be able to speak about this.
Thanks very much. Look, we often get asked how our clients can deal with high-risk customers, and particularly politically exposed persons, or PEPs, as they're commonly called. What are the first steps if you come across a high-risk client or PEP?
Yeah, it's a good question, Lincoln. It's a good question whenever we get asked by one of our clients about this. And as with most questions about how to discharge obligations under the Act, the answer really is, as we say to our clients, is to consult your AML CTF program. The program really is each business's guide to how it discharges its obligations under the Act. So it's important that each business's program is tailored to the MLTF risks that it faces in the course of its business. So this includes its processes for identifying potential clients as PEPs, as you say, its systems for classifying clients as low, medium, or high risk, and then ultimately how to deal with those kinds of clients. In terms of the legislation, the AML CTF rules do give some practical guidance as to the steps a business can take when dealing with a high-risk client or a foreign PEP. These steps are referred to in the rules as a business's Enhanced Customer Due Diligence Program, or ECDD program for short. Each program must include this kind of an ECDD program to be applied when dealing with high-risk clients or foreign PEPs, including steps such as clarifying or updating KYC information, beneficial owner information, and source of funds and wealth information in respect of a customer, re-verifying the customer in accordance with the business's program, conducting further analysis and monitoring of the customer's transactions, and seeking senior management approval as to whether the business relationship should be continued and whether the designated service should be provided at all. So as with all of the processes listed in an AML CTF program, a business's ECDD program should be tailored to that business, and it really should reflect the business's risk appetite for example, onboarding high-risk customers, and should also reflect what other steps the business can actually take in practice when dealing with these kinds of customers. In our experience, businesses, particularly in the funds management space, which assess their MLTF risk as low and whose typical clientele are classified as low or low to medium risk, usually have very little appetite for onboarding a client who is a foreign PEP or who was flagged as a high-risk client. In these instances, while guidance in the AML CTF rules about ECDD programs can be helpful, it doesn't prevent the business from, for example, simply making the decision not to onboard a client because they've been flagged as high risk or because they're a foreign PEP. So in short, it's really a long-winded way of saying how a business deals with these kinds of customers is primarily a matter of its own risk appetite. If a decision has been made to onboard a high-risk customer, businesses should ensure it applies its ECDD program in compliance with the Act and the rules.
Right. Thank you, Andrew. The world's getting smaller every day, and foreign capital is attractive for a lot of our clients. But if someone has alleged money laundering offences against them in another country, what should our clients do to onboard them, and should they?
Yeah, it's good that you raised the two different questions of can a client still onboard them, and really sometimes when we get asked the question, the starting point for the business isn't necessarily to ask can we onboard them, but should we, and that's going to be, again, as I said in response to the first question, really a matter of the business's own risk appetite and its own risk profile. As I mentioned before, in our experience, where a business has been alerted to a customer's prior offences or alleged offences for money laundering in another country, for example, or otherwise appear on blacklists or sanction lists, or any other kinds of lists that clients can subscribe to, in ensuring that they are identifying their clients. There's typically a pretty low tolerance for onboarding these kinds of clients, given those businesses typically only provide designated services to low or low to medium risk clients. So getting past the should we onboard question and onto the can we onboard question, again, this is a matter of ensuring a business's AML CTF program is tailored to the business's risk appetite, how it plans to deal with customers in these kinds of situations, including what additional steps, if any, it should take to ensure it can onboard the customer without inadvertently laundering money or financing terrorism. I think firstly, it's important that the program sets out red flag indicators and other criteria which are tailored to the business and which can assist staff in classifying a client as low, medium, or high risk. A danger we commonly see in these situations is, for example, where a business's senior management clearly think it's risky to onboard a client, for example, due to allegations of money laundering offences, but when consulting the AML CTF program, they find they've accidentally specified alleged money laundering offences as only an indicator that the customer is a medium risk, not a high risk client. Now, if the program doesn't allow senior management within the business to have discretion to treat that customer as a high risk client, it can be hard for the business to justify applying its ECDD program and to conduct the checks necessary to ensure it can onboard the specific customer, in a way that is mitigating the risk of potentially laundering money or inadvertently facilitating the laundering of money or the financing of terrorism. And it can really slow down the business's ability to, for example, re-verify the information provided by the customer or to conduct more detailed monitoring of the customer's transactions, which may be necessary to mitigate the MLTF risks faced by the business by onboarding the customer. The takeaway from this example situation is that adopting standardized or template ML-CTF programs can be dangerous and can result in situations where the program says the business must do one thing, but the business wants to do another, or where the business wants to take a certain step, but isn't supported by its own program to do so. The program has got to be in lockstep with the business's attitude towards mitigating MLTF risks, so that whatever decision the business makes in relation to, for example, a customer with alleged money laundering offences in another country, their program supports them in doing so, and vice versa. If the business isn't sure as to how it should deal with a customer with alleged money laundering offences, the program should be instructive and guide the business and its staff about whether the customer can be onboarded and what additional due diligence, if any, the business should undertake.
So you mentioned, Andrew, there steps and processes which an AML program needs to contain. The risk and danger if you've just got an off-the-shelf program and it's what's happening in the business in reality is not in lockstep with the program itself. So what are some common failures you've seen in AML CTF programs?
Yeah, thanks, Landon. It's another good question. There are two that come to mind. I've gone on a bit about the first one in the first couple of questions. It's, as you say, when AML CTF programs are, aren't specifically tailored to a business or off the shelf, as you say. We've identified, again, some practice within industry of businesses adopting these sort of off-the-shelf programs as a sort of a set and forget document, or in the worst case, I've seen, programs which are simply copies of the AML CTF Act and rules into a document, and they've called this a program. There are just countless examples of how this can result in inadvertent breaches of the business's own program by the business itself, and accidentally exposing themselves to penalties under the Act for non-compliance with their program. So just, a couple of examples of how this could happen. A template program could set, for example, an arbitrary frequency for conducting independent reviews of the program under the Act. And the frequency could be set so that the independent reviews have to be done every year or even every 2 years. And if the business doesn't take note of this requirement, it easily opens them up to non-compliance with the program. The program might also state that the business will conduct AML CTF risk awareness training every few months for its employees, but the business might think it's sufficient for the employees to receive training on an annual basis. And even if when conducting annual AML CTF risk awareness training would be appropriate for the business's MLTF risk, the business would still not technically have complied with their program because it says that they needed to conduct that training every couple of months. That's just two examples of sort of low-hanging fruit a business can patch up in its own program to make sure it's tailored to how the business in practice discharges its obligations under the Act. Another common failure that we see in programs is really about the readability of the programs themselves. Reporting entities should, and I'm tempted to say must, read these programs, particularly when the staff are involved in the provision of designated services by the business. If the program isn't readable or is long to the point of being incomprehensible, the program can't really serve the vital function within the business of providing guidance to its staff about the business's attitude towards combating the laundering of money or the financing of terrorism. But when done correctly, a program that is read by all staff involved in the provision of designated services can really foster a culture of compliance from the bottom up and can ensure all employees and members of a reporting entity are involved in ensuring the business complies with its obligations under the Act, rather than this sort of being the sole responsibility of a compliance manager, compliance officer, or an AML CTF compliance officer within the business. And it's often the case that businesses ask us whether they can take a certain action, for example, conduct electronic verification or outsource the conducting of KYC. And the answer will be in the program, but just buried within page 40 of a 100-page or longer document. And it just makes complying with obligations under the Act that much more time-consuming and painful. All in all, there's sort of still a balance to be struck between ensuring the program is compliant with the Act and the rules and making sure it's still a document that really should be able to be picked up and read from cover to cover. And sometimes this balance is harder to strike. But in our experience, the majority of programs that we see could at least do with a plain English refresh, so that it's not just the lawyers and the compliance experts that can read these documents, but as is necessary for any business providing designated services, can and should be read by all staff involved in the provision of those services.
I think it's great counsel, Andrew, to have reader-friendly and usable documents. So you've seen any other developments in AML programs which would assist our clients, and I know AUSTRAC has come out with some regulatory focus in the coming year or so. Are programs going to be subjected to procedural changes or more fulsome risk assessments, for example?
Yeah, it's another good question, and I think a lot of AUSTRAC's focus on this and the changes that will need to be made to programs will sort of come out of the reforms to the AML laws that are currently in Parliament, which I think we will talk about in another episode of this series as well. In terms of just generally within the sort of AML programs as part of the current AML CTF regime, there are a couple of developments that have just been ongoing for the last couple of years, resulting from reforms that have been made over the last 5 to 10 years. A major one is outsourcing, which is also something we've talked about in another episode of the series. Outsourcing and reliance of KYC checks has been the subject of a lot of AUSTRAC consultation with industry in the past couple of years. In short, and I don't want to get too bogged down in the detail, but reporting entities can appoint someone else to conduct KYC checks on its customers. And in the funds management space, this is often done by a fund administrator or a specific third-party service provider appointed to conduct KYC checks on the fund manager's behalf. Alternatively, reporting entities are also able to rely on the KYC checks done by another reporting entity, either on an ongoing basis pursuant to a written agreement or on a case-by-case basis. In my experience, sort of the difference between these options is not often well understood within industry. There's quite a substantial difference, particularly when it comes to liability for KYC failures, between appointing someone to conduct KYC checks on your behalf and relying on the KYC checks that another reporting entity has done on your customers. And so putting that in mind, it's important for businesses' AML CTF programs to spell out exactly when and how they are entitled to appoint someone as agent to conduct KYC checks on their behalf. And when, on the other hand, they are entitled to rely on another reporting entity's KYC checks, and really in practice to understand when it's going to be the former situation and when it's a situation where we are relying on the KYC checks conducted by another reporting entity. Helpfully, I know it's complex, but AUSTRAC does have quite a bit of guidance on the different options, which we recommend all businesses take a look at should they have any questions about the outsourcing of these KYC checks. Similarly, sort of the rise of digital solutions for discharging AML CTF obligations is sometimes not dealt with in detail in AML CTF programs, and it's a development that's sort of occurred over the last 10 or so years. The AML CTF Act and rules do allow reporting entities to conduct electronic verification of their customers' identities. But in our experience, and particularly in the funds management space, there's not a clear delineation by businesses as to whether they're continuing to verify customers by way of traditional document-based verification, where we receive original or certified copies of identification and that kind of thing in order to verify our customers. And it's also unclear whether they've begun to adopt new electronic means of verifying customers, or ultimately if they use a mix of both methods. And we think it's important for all businesses to ensure their programs spell out the manner of verification of their customers going forward. Austrac has quite a bit of guidance on this as well, which we recommend businesses take a look at should they have any questions, and failing that, to get legal advice as to how they might continue to verify customers in the face of the rise of digital AML and KYC solutions.
Thanks, Andrew. Further good counsel there with the modern world and the digital verification. And we heard from Elliot in a previous episode about the liability, which remains depending on who you outsource your identification to. So nice to have that reaffirmed. Thanks very much, Andrew, for joining us today and sharing your insights on the risks and common failures in AML CTF programs. And thanks everyone for listening today. We hope you can join us again for the final episode in HW Fund's podcast series on AML CTF issues, being independent reviews. As always, please get in touch with us if you have any questions. You can find our details on our website, which is hallandwilcox.com.au, or connect with us on LinkedIn. And if you enjoyed today's episode, then rate, review, or follow our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks very much.
This podcast is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should always obtain legal advice about your specific circumstances.